Elohim is not a name for God.
Well, of course not. It's a title like president or doctor. But, all right, let's see it.
The English translation for the opening verse of the Bible says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth."
Well, that's a traditional but outdated translation. A more correct translation would be, "When God began to create the heavens and the earth."
But there's a huge problem with this verse. In ancient Hebrew, Elohim is a masculine plural noun meaning gods or divine beings. And yes, your Strong's Concordance added the singular God to that definition.
So this gets one thing right and then gets pretty much everything else wrong. It is true that Elohim is grammatically masculine plural in form. However, it can be used in reference not only to individual singular deities, but also to female deities, to goddesses. So although it is masculine plural in grammatical form, semantically it can be singular and it is not marked for gender. And this is all a lot more complex and a lot more simple than this content creator is making it out to be. However, if someone is using Strong's right off the bat, they very clearly don't know Hebrew. Strong's did not add the singular to the definition. It did add judges, because Elohim never refers to human judges anywhere in the Hebrew Bible. No, not even in that verse. It never refers to human judges. But it can be used in reference to individual deities as well as plural deities. Now, let's look at some more up-to-date and some more accurate resources. This is the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, widely considered the most authoritative lexicon of biblical Hebrew. And you can see sense number 1 is the basic masculine plural grammatical form, gods. But then we have in sense C of sense number 1, God or deity in the singular. So Halot recognizes that it can be used in the singular. Then we have Klein's Dictionary of Classical Hebrew. You can see down in the bottom left, you have the beginning of the entry, and it is basing its ordering of the senses on commonality, on frequency. And so the most frequent use of the masculine plural Elohim is in reference to the singular God of Israel. So the singular sense is first. And you actually have to go down several pages in Klein's to get down to sense 2a, other gods, the basic plural sense. Then we have the Theological Dictionary of the Old Testament, which has an 18-page entry that we're not going to go through, but it says the same. It can be used in the singular. It can also be used in the plural. But for the best discussion of what's going on here, why is this grammatically plural, but it can be used in the singular and in a way that's also not marked for gender? The best discussion is Joel S. Burnett's book, A Reassessment of Biblical Elohim, from almost 25 years ago. And it points out that Elohim is a concretized abstract plural. And this is based on the observation that in ancient Semitic languages, including Biblical Hebrew, you can use the plural of a noun in order to refer to an abstraction based on the concept that the singular noun is referring to. And with Elohim, it would refer to divinity, the abstraction divinity. However, it could be used so frequently in reference to actual instantiations of divinity that it can go back to being concretized. In other words, people use the plural to refer to the abstraction. That abstraction was used in reference to specific deities, and so the word became concretized all over again. And this concretization divested it of its marking for gender. And so now it just means something closer to the English deity, which can be masculine or feminine, and can be abstract or concrete. So the best translation of Elohim would just be deity or divine, because it can also be used in the adjectival sense. It is not used to mean judges. It is not used as an honorific. It refers to a deity, to plural deities, or to the divine.
Christians will say, oh, well, that is just referring to the Trinity, that God is 3 in 1.
No, it is absolutely nowhere being used in reference to the Trinity, and in no small part because the concept of the Trinity would not develop until between the 2nd and the 5th centuries CE, but also because when Elohim is being used with singular verbs, pronouns, pronominal suffixes, and the like, it is being used as a singular noun. If it's being used with plural verbs, pronouns, pronominal suffixes, and the like, then it's being used as a plural noun. That's how you can tell which it is. And the overwhelming majority of the uses of Elohim are as a singular noun.
There's only one small problem with this. The concept of the Trinity did not exist in human thought until the 2nd century. So how could that be what the writers of Genesis meant?
Yes, they definitely weren't referring to the Trinity. However, I think this argument is starting to bleed into a different issue entirely, which is what the singular deity who is speaking in Genesis 1, 26 and 27 means when they use the first person plural cohortative verb, let us make, which is entirely distinct from whether or not Elohim is singular or plural, because that verse begins with Vayomer Elohim, which is a singular verb and just means, and Elohim said. So it would be no different from me speaking to my family and saying, let's not have Cafe Rio for dinner. That does not mean that I am some kind of plurality or that I'm supposed to actually be multiple people. It just means that one individual is speaking to multiple people.
So here's what the ancient Hebrew actually tells us.
I'm concerned that this is not going to actually be what the ancient Hebrew tells us.
Throughout Genesis, Elohim is used with plural verbs and pronouns.
This is entirely false. Of the 219 total occurrences of the Hebrew word Elohim in the book of Genesis, more than 200 of them are used in connection with singular verb forms, with singular adjectives or pronominal suffixes, or in connection with singular pronouns. However, there is something interesting to note here in Genesis 20, verse 13, where Abraham talks about when God caused me to wander from my father's house, the verb form is plural. So a more accurate translation would be when God's caused me to wander from my father's house. But everywhere else, the singular is very clearly being used to refer to the God of Israel, except for a few scattered references to plural gods, which usually has to do with Laban's teraphim or divine images or something like that.
In Genesis 1:26, the text says, "Let us make human beings in our likeness." Then in Genesis 3:22, after humans eat from the tree of knowledge, it says, "The human has become like one of us." One of us? If God is one, how can the human become like one of us? This is multiple divine beings having a conversation about the humans.
So here again, we are blurring the lines of distinction between two different things. What Elohim means is very clear in Genesis 1:26 and in Genesis 3:22. It is being used with a singular verb, Vayomer Elohim, and God said. That's singular. The same is true of Genesis 3:22, although it's Adonai Elohim, and then the verb is singular. The fact that God is speaking to other gods has nothing to do with whether or not the Hebrew word Elohim is singular or plural. It's singular in both verses. Now, the other question is, who are these others that are a part of the us that God is talking to? And the consensus among scholars is that this is a reference to the divine council, the other gods of the early Israelite pantheon. So yes, there is divine plurality going on here, but it is unrelated to the question of the grammatical number of the Hebrew noun Elohim.
But here's where it really gets interesting. There's a passage that Bible scholars call the smoking gun.
Oh, really?
Joshua chapter 24, verse 14. Joshua is giving a speech to the Israelites, and he says this, "Put away the Elohim that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve Yahweh." Wait, put away the Elohim and serve Yahweh. That means Yahweh and the Elohim are not the same thing.
So this is a simple category error. To say put away your Elohim and only serve Adonai is not to identify all the occurrences of Elohim within the Hebrew Bible as references to deities other than Adonai. The overwhelming majority of the occurrences of Elohim in the Hebrew Bible are in clear, explicit, and unambiguous reference to Adonai, the God of Israel. What we find in Joshua, in no way, shape, or form whatsoever, supports the conclusion that Elohim is a different deity from Adonai. That would be like saying if I tell my daughters, hey, stop having dinner with all these other fathers around the neighborhood and only have dinner with me, Dan. It doesn't mean that every reference to father means someone other than Dan. I can also be father. I'm just not the only one. But, just like in Joshua, it is a demand for an exclusive relationship. This is why in Deuteronomy 6:4, the Shema, it says, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai our God. The use of pronominal suffixes attached to the Hebrew word Elohim makes clear there are multiple Elohim out there, but one for the people of Israel. My God, your God, his God, their God, y'all's God, our God. God is just a noun that can be used in reference to a variety of different deities. But again, in the overwhelming majority of the occurrences of Elohim in the Hebrew Bible, it is in the singular, and it is in clear, explicit, and unambiguous reference to Adonai, the God of Israel. However, there are one or two occurrences of Elohim where it's in reference to a high deity that is probably to be distinguished from Adonai. And Deuteronomy 32:8-9 is probably the clearest example. That's where Elyon is dividing up the nations and distributing them to the Bnei Elohim, the children of God. And then verse 9 says, and Adonai's portion was his people, Jacob his share of the inheritance. And a lot of critical scholars, including myself, agree that this is distinguishing Elyon from Adonai. Adonai is one of the Bnei Elohim, is one of the children of God, where Elohim there is in reference to Elyon as the Northwest Semitic patriarchal high deity. So that does not hold for absolutely every last occurrence of the singular use of Elohim, but it occurs for the overwhelming majority of them. And no, this is not saying that Adonai is a distinct deity from the Elohim that is being used elsewhere in Genesis and Joshua and elsewhere in the Hebrew Bible.
Joshua is literally telling the Israelites to reject the Elohim their ancestors served in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt and instead serve Yahweh. He's making a distinction. Yahweh is one entity, the Elohim are multiple entities, and Yahweh is calling his people away from the other Elohim.
Yes, it is a call to stop following the other gods of the other nations and to only be committed to Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai our God, the God of Israel. And I think the biggest problem here is with the claim that every occurrence of Elohim throughout Genesis is plural. That's demonstrably false, but that does betray abject ignorance of biblical Hebrew and how it works.
So what happened? Scholars have shown that Hebrew scribes who revised and compiled the Torah took older stories about multiple Elohim and inserted the name Yahweh on top of them.
So we are blurring lines again here. I and other scholars have argued that Adonai was not the original God of Israel, that El, or Elyon, was the earliest God of Israel, the Northwest Semitic patriarchal high deity, and that Adonai was a secondary addition to the Israelite pantheon that originally came into the pantheon on the second tier as one of the Bnei Elohim, but was very early on conflated with El. So in those very, very few passages where we get a glimpse at this pre-conflation distinction between the two, there does seem to be a difference between whoever is labeled the Elohim of Israel and Adonai. However, that is limited to passages you can count on one hand. That is not even remotely a representative number, much less half or a majority of the occurrences of the word Elohim. So it's not like Adonai was just plastered all over the place and either replaced Elohim or was conflated with Elohim. That conflation took place before virtually all of the texts of the Hebrew Bible were written. So the argument that is being made here is kind of gesturing in the direction of some actual scholarship, but misunderstanding and misrepresenting it and drawing wildly unsupported conclusions from that fuzzy idea of what scholars have said about this.
They were trying to turn polytheistic stories into monotheistic ones. They were essentially doing a find and replace. Elohim becomes Yahweh.
This is not at all accurate.
When you understand this, it explains why the Old Testament God regularly flies into fits of rage and commits mass murder and genocide. This wasn't God, the Heavenly Father of Jesus. These are stories about one or more Elohim doing these horrific things, all conflated into one composite character, Yahweh.
Okay, now we're slipping into anti-Semitic territory. When you find yourself trying to argue that the Hebrew Bible presents a single view of God as violent, hateful, and vengeful, and the New Testament presents a single view of God as loving, kind, and merciful, you're promoting an anti-Semitic trope that has a long history of promoting not just anti-Semitism, but violence against Jewish people. So it's not true factually, because you have both a violent and a merciful deity in the Hebrew Bible, and both a violent and a merciful deity in the New Testament. And to the degree that you can speak about a shift in the direction of a more merciful deity, it actually happens before the end of the Hebrew Bible and before the transition to the New Testament. So again, it is factually wrong, and particularly in light of the inaccurate claims about what Elohim means and how Adonai relates to Elohim in the Hebrew Bible. But it is additionally an anti-Semitic trope that we should do our best to avoid.
If you want to learn more about the man-made corruption of the Bible and join a community returning to the way of...
Nah, I'm good. And the fit for this video has been the Data Over Dogma podcast.